Thank you, Yvonne, for that wonderful introduction. I am so honored to be here with you and to imagine that 150 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, I would be standing here at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial. And I have to tell you that I feel my ancestors with me, my heroes. And it's very humbling. And I'm so honored that you all would come out today and to be with us for this weekend of prayer to end slavery. You know, as I was introduced, did Yvonne say I was the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass? That's 3 greats. And then I think she said I'm the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. You know, every time I tell people what my relationship is to these 2 great American heroes, not only is it a mouthful trying to spit out all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you may be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to both Douglass and Washington. But by show of hands, how many of you know or knew a grandparent? Everybody. How about a great-grandparent? Well, that's how close I feel to both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, because my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she actually met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl, and she lived to be 103 years old. She lived well into my 20s. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I was born right here in Washington, D.C., and I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. You've seen pictures, obviously. And then I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when I stopped to think that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine, in a sense I can say I stand just one person away from history. We're not that far removed from this history. And as I've traveled around and had the honor to be with more than 50,000 middle school and high school students over the past several years that we've been doing this, they think that this happened so long ago, that slavery happened so long ago, and that the work of the great heroes and sheroes that came before us happened so long ago. Now, the question that I always get, people always want to know, and I bet you're sitting there wondering the same thing, is how are you related to both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington? Anybody wondering that? Well, you can turn around all the way in the back corner is how it happened, and that is my mother, Nettie Washington Douglass. Her father was Frederick Douglass III, and he was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. And then her mother, Nettie Hancock Washington, was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. And the 2 of them met in 1941 at Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University. It was founded by Booker T. Washington in 1881. And my grandparents were walking across campus, and they literally bumped into each other. They didn't know that the other descended from an historic family, and they fell in love at first sight. And they wound up getting married 3 months later. So I think there was some divine intervention there. And when my mom was born, Nettie Washington Douglass, she was the first person to unite the bloodlines of the families. She was an only child, so I have the honor and privilege and blessing to be the first male to unite the bloodlines. So that's how the 2 families collided, as we like to say. The other question that I always get is, so you're related to Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do as president of the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation and why we still need abolitionists today. Because as we know, slavery still exists. It didn't end with the work of Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But before I do get into all of that, I always like to take the opportunity. I don't want to assume that you know who Frederick Douglass is and you know who Booker T. Washington is. So I'm just going to talk about them briefly so you can have an idea of the foundation that our organization is built upon. Frederick Douglass was born a slave. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, that way, to a black woman and a white man, and it was presumed that his father was his slave master. He only saw his mother on 3 occasions his whole life. And that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields from sunup to sundown picking cotton. And then she would walk 12 miles in the middle of the night to spend just a few precious moments with her son, who was about 1 year old at the time. And then she would walk 12 miles back to the plantation so that she could be back there by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was likely going to endure a brutal beating. So he was raised by his grandmother. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was 8 years old. He used to sleep head first into an old corn sack on a cold, damp, muddy floor, because that's the only way that he could try and keep warm. He always talked about he had this pit of hunger in his stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when he would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush, throw it into a pig's trough, and all of the slave children would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try and get what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what they were considered. They were property. They were no better than the sheep and the cows and the horses, and in some cases they were treated worse. When he was 6 years old, his grandmother said, his grandmother was the one who raised him, and she said, we're going to go on a long journey. And that journey was a 20-mile walk to the main plantation, where she would drop him off, and the only person that he had ever known, his family, and that loved him, would leave, and he would never see her again. When he was 9 years old, he had what he called divine providence in his favor. And that was, he was chosen from among all of the slave children to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's brother. But when he got there, his slave mistress had never had slaves before, and she didn't know that it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write. So she began to teach young Frederick how to read. But when her husband, Hugh, found out about it, he forbade it. And he said, you cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. Did you guys hear that message? Well, he certainly had heard it, and he knew that if he didn't want me to have this so badly, he was going to do everything in his power to gain it. And he realized that knowledge was power, and it would one day be his key to freedom. Now, at the age of 18 years old, he would make his first attempt to escape slavery. He was caught, he was thrown in jail, and then in 1838, at the age of 20, he would disguise himself as a sailor and carry with him forged identification papers, and he would finally escape the chains that bound him. He would eventually settle in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and come into contact with the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. They found themselves at an anti-slavery meeting together, and Garrison was so impressed with this fugitive slave, he said, will you stand up and will you tell your story? And Douglass stood up, and he talks about how nervous he was, that his knees were knocking together. But he had this gift. He had a gift of communication and the way that he was able to speak and write. There were no slaves before him that could ever tell the story like this fugitive slave could tell it. And that's why I think, and I applaud, I know that there are some survivors here with us today, and I applaud you, because that is the most important role in this movement, because there is nobody that's more qualified to speak out against the kinds of injustices that you survived. So I applaud you for that. And that was the importance of Frederick Douglass. He was speaking out against injustice. And then he would go on and he would tour with William Lloyd Garrison, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story because we'd be here all day, but as you know, he went on to become one of the most important abolitionists that this country has known. Friends with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln did not consider African Americans to be equal to whites. So the importance of the relationship that those two men had was because Lincoln could now look at Douglass and say, this is my equal. And I truly believe that had they not had that friendship, slavery could have gone on who knows how much longer, 50, 60 years, and we'd be a very different country than we are today. So I'm standing right here, I can't believe this. Booker T. Washington was also born a slave. But he benefited from Frederick Douglass and the work of the abolitionists because he was 9 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and he and his family were freed. He wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia. He would work 12, 14-hour days just so he could save enough money to go to school. He would enter Hampton Institute when he was just 16 years old. He would go on to graduate and start Tuskegee, as I mentioned, in 1881 when he was just 25 years old. Now, he founded Tuskegee as a way to give freed African Americans an education, because when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and there were 4 million people freed, they were freed without a plan. There was no counseling or traumatic stress disorder. They didn't know how to read and write for the most part. So he had to start at the basics, and in some cases he had to teach them how to tie their shoes and how to brush their teeth. But Booker T. Washington's importance was because he taught them something that they knew how to do, a tool, a trade, so that they could have a stake in the nation's growing economy. But rather than demanding that the white race change their ways, Booker T. Washington showed freed African Americans how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles and develop strength of character and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom, and it may be said that he is the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. And as I stand here today, in the vast shadow of my ancestors, it makes me think about my own role. It makes me think about my responsibility. And it makes me think about the debt that I owe to those that came before me. Now, I've always known that I've descended from these great men, but I never celebrated it. I never embraced it. And there were many reasons for that. There was a lot of pressure that was put on the males in the family to be the next Frederick Douglass. I told you about the happy love story of my grandparents, but there's also a very tragic side to this story. My grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, was a brilliant man. He was a surgeon. And the reason that he was there at Tuskegee on that fateful day was he had been commissioned down there by the Veterans Administration during World War II. And he always walked around with this weight of expectations on his shoulders. And when my grandmother was 3 months pregnant with my mom, my grandfather, that weight of expectation became too much for him to endure, and he took his own life. So my mother was born without a father. She was raised without a father. And then when I came along, and I had this dual lineage, my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents went in the complete opposite direction, and they weren't going to force anything on me. So I didn't want anything to do with this. I spent my whole life running away, and I'm embarrassed to say that I was well into my 30s before I even understood the significance of the contributions of my ancestors, let alone start to embrace what they had done, and this lineage and this blood that flows through my veins. Also here with me today is Robert Benz, who is a good friend of mine, and he's our executive vice president, one of the founders. Robert and I have known each other for close to 30 years, and Robert handed me a National Geographic magazine in 2006. And the cover story was 21st Century Slaves. And I looked at that headline, and I reacted the way I think most people do the first time they hear about the existence of human trafficking and modern-day slavery, and I thought, slavery ended. It ended with the work of Frederick Douglass and the Emancipation Proclamation. But as Robert and I started to research this issue, we found that slavery still exists in every civilized and uncivilized country around the world, and it affects every race in the human family. And slavery still exists here today, right here, in Washington, D.C., and all across this country, as many of you know. And I remember reading this story, and I'm reading about a 12-year-old girl that was forced to service 30, 35 men a day. And I have 2 daughters. And at the time, my girls were 12 and 9 years old. And I remember sitting in the living room, and it was nighttime, and my wife was putting our girls to bed. And my girls were laughing, and they were playing. And I'm thinking, this is what young girls should be doing. They should be getting tucked safely into their bed. And then I go back to the story, and I'm reading about this 12-year-old girl. And when I got up, I walked into their bedroom, and I realized that I could not look them in the eyes. I couldn't look them in the eyes and just walk away from this. So I sold my business. Robert and I and my mom started the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation. Now, how many of you remember Roots, Alex Haley's Roots? Well, for those of you that don't, that are too young, Alex Haley was an author, and he traced his family back to Africa. And then there was an ABC miniseries produced in the 70s, and there were millions of Americans that were glued to their television every night because it was the first time this country was seeing what legalized state-sanctioned slavery looked like. And I remember watching that when I was younger and thinking, if I lived during that time, I would be an abolitionist. I think we all feel that, right? We wouldn't sit back and we wouldn't suffer injustices, and we would fight for those that can't fight for themselves, and we would seek justice for the oppressed. Well, the problem with that thinking is I could never prove that to myself, because you're talking about crimes of the past. Now, all of a sudden, here I was faced with a present-day crime, and I knew that I just couldn't walk away from it. So we started the organization, and the way that we went about educating the public is where I think education should start, and that's with young people. So we went into schools and we started talking about the history of slavery in this country and the abolitionists and how they went about abolishing slavery and what communication tools did they have at their disposal that they used. They gave speeches, they published newspapers, they wrote books, they passed out leaflets and pamphlets. And we thought, well, today's students have the greatest communication tool known to man in the palm of their hands, and the way that you all are communicating with each other through social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and text messaging. Through the stroke of a key, you can reach more people with this message than Frederick Douglass could have reached his whole career as a publisher, publishing the North Star newspaper. So there's power there. And we also decided to go into schools that are in economically challenged areas where young girls are most vulnerable to becoming victims of sex trafficking. Because the average age that a girl is forced into prostitution in this country is between the ages of 12 and 14 years old. That says that there is a need to be in front of girls that are that age. There's also a need to be in front of boys and to talk to them about their attitudes towards women and the choices they make as adults. If they make the wrong choices, how it feeds into the demand side of this. Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And we believe that. Booker T. Washington also said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else. And our young people, we give them projects, service projects, all around raising awareness about this issue. And what we find is it empowers them because they're working on a global issue that's greater than they are. And they're seeing that there are mostly women and children around the world that are facing greater challenges than they are in their own lives. And then when they look at the legacies of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, they can look at those as tangible examples that if they were able to overcome the obstacles that they overcame and rise up to affect the lives of millions of people, then our children can do the same thing. They can overcome any obstacle that seems insurmountable. So we believe that we need to get at the root cause of this issue. It's natural that your first reaction is we always react with the heart. Victims need services. We have to continue to support and provide services for victims. But we also need to understand that we have to put some effort on the prevention side. And I know there are organizations here that are doing that. And it seems like common sense. But we need to make sure that we get at the root cause of this issue. Because if we're just pulling people out of slavery, then we're not doing anything to keep others from coming in. We're also here to pray this weekend. And the organizers of the event want to get 1 million people around the country to pray for the end of slavery over the weekend. We also need to make sure that we take action. It can't just be about the end of slavery through prayer. Faith can move a mighty mountain, but faith will not break one shackle or one chain. It takes action. Frederick Douglass said, I prayed for 20 years, but my prayers weren't answered until I prayed with my legs. And what that meant was he was a slave for 20 years, and he was praying for deliverance. But when he finally decided to take action and run away, that's when his prayers were answered. This is a powerful weekend, what we'll be doing here today. But we need to make sure that we walk away and we take action. Today, we were over at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Anacostia. How many of you have been over there? Well, I encourage you to go, because if you don't go, you're not going to truly understand what this man was about. It's a wonderful place. It's where he spent the last 18 years of his life. And I remember being a little boy going to that home and going on tours there. And what I realized is that history lives in me. It lives within me. It lives in each and every one of you. We don't have to descend from a Douglass or a Washington or somebody who's famous to make a difference. But each and every one of us has greatness running through our veins, and we can do great things. History lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forth, because we are the sons and daughters, and we are the grandsons and granddaughters. Some of us are the products of slavery, and this country is the product of the abolition of slavery. From Frederick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. And from Martin Luther King Jr., on those steps 50 years ago this year, we learned that as free citizens, we have the same rights as all citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by great men like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood runs through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. And we're worried more today about who's going to win the Super Bowl next month than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. We live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery are hard to hear from where we stand. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from the slaves of today. And when we listen close enough, that's when change will happen. We're doing God's work. We're doing the work of the Lord. And we're standing on the shoulders of all of those that came before us. And we're walking in their shoes. 3 years ago, I was at the Frederick Douglass home, and we were celebrating his birthday, which is on February 14th. And by the way, he didn't know when he was born. There were no records. There were no birth certificates. But he chose February 14th as his birthday because his mother used to call him her little Valentine. So I was speaking to a group of 6th graders. And at the end, this girl raised her hand and she said, "Mr. Morris, what must it be like to walk in the shoes of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington?" And I thought, wow, that's a deep question, especially coming from a 10-year-old. And it reminded me of my time in Washington when I used to go to that home on field trips. And we would walk around the house just like I did today. We'd walk up the stairs, and down the hall is his bedroom. And on his bed is his nightshirt. And next to the bed on a chair is his hat. And on the floor is a pair of his shoes. And you know how when you go into museums, they always have that velvet rope blocking off the room so you can't get in? Well, there's one of those there. And I remember being a little boy, and I always wanted to sneak past that rope to try those shoes on. Well, this day in February, something happened that never happened before. The tour guide took us on a VIP tour, and there were about 25 of us, and we walked through the house like I had done so many times before. We walked up the stairs and down the hall, and there were those shoes again. But something happened this time that was different. The tour guide took the rope down, and she said, "Come on in." So the group of us came in, and it's not a very big room, so 25 people in there. We were standing shoulder to shoulder, so we were crammed together like sardines. And do you know where they put me? They put me right next to the shoes. And I looked down and I said, there they are. After all of these years, all I would have to do is just slip off my shoes, and I could just slide right into them, and no one would ever know. And I'd be taking pictures. I'm in Frederick Douglass's shoes. But I never did. I never tried those shoes on because I knew that they wouldn't fit. Those shoes are too big for any of us to fit into. But what I realized at that moment is that I can take the shoes that I've got, and you all can take the shoes that you've got, and we can lead the way to a brighter future. We can lead the way to a better tomorrow. And each and every one of us can make the difference in the lives of those around us. And just like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr., we can affect the lives of many. Thank you very much for listening, and God bless you.
Saved a was blind, but now I see. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will